Your ego is not your enemy, so please stop trying to kill your ego, abandon your ego, bypass your ego, transcend your ego, or otherwise pretend that you can live a healthy, mature adult life without a strong sense of egoic identity. It's time to go into the transpersonal psychology and the Jungian psychology and a few different other perspectives I'm going to weave in to clear up this question once and for all, because fortunately, although it might be a very common sense saying, a very colloquial, well, you need to drop your ego and that guy's got too much ego, if you actually go into the psychological truth of what it means to have a mature, healthy ego, you're going to see this whole question from a different perspective. Unfortunately, the people who watch my videos have these kinds of questions of how to develop a healthy ego, so that's exactly what we're going to do today. But let's frame the question again. By the end of this video, I can't go into everything. I mean, this book, I think this one, I'm holding upside down, but this one took around a decade to write. Edward Edinger with Ego and Archetype. Michael Washburn and Edward Edinger, they are master psychologists. They're writing this at the peak of their careers. I am not going to be able to do justice in just one YouTube video. So hopefully I leave you with a feeling of, yeah, let's go towards these very highly appropriate, advanced, just goldmine books. But let's frame it with a bit of James Hollis, Why Good People Do Bad Things. And this is where we start to get problematic. We need to first clear up the misconceptions around killing your ego or dropping your ego until I can convince you that having a healthy, mature ego is indeed a worthwhile pursuit. So I've got this extract from the end of this book about shadow work primarily, and it's a very well-written book, but this particular extract, this particular sentiment is part of the problem. Let me read it for you. Shadow work always challenges the ego, overthrows it, humbles it, sometimes even slays it. That, paradoxically, is its gift if we can bear such a gift. Yet who wants to grow through the gift of egocide, to be slain by the ever greater, dying unto what we once thought of ourselves, or of the world, or wish still to think? Who really wants to work so hard? But consider what happens to us, to our relationships, to the world, when we do not do our work. And then a few more pages on this wonderfully well-written, I can appreciate it, I can really appreciate the language, this wonderfully well-written sentiment around how shadow work challenges our ego identity. And this phrase ego is a three-letter word that has many different meanings, and we just need to clarify what it means to actually have an ego. Most people, when they say, oh, he's full of ego, or drop the ego, or he's got too much ego, what they're actually talking about there isn't the psychological construct of an ego, which is your solid sense of adult identity, your sense of, I am Jordan, I am a man, here I am, here are my preferences, here are my values, here's my history, here's my future, here's my dreams. People aren't referring to the ego. They're referring to someone's sense of arrogance or unpalatable behaviors, or maybe their inability to take criticism. That's not the same thing, and we have these same narratives repeated again and again and again in everyday life of, that guy's full of ego, or she needs to drop her ego, and it leads us towards deeply conditioned subconscious programming of ego avoidance. And then this is where it gets very tricky. We then get a little bit of a spiritual hit. We have a spiritual awakening of one form or another, and you enter your first meditation circle, and you might hear someone whisper at the back of the room, hey, I found a way to drop my ego, or we need to transcend the ego, or enlightenment's all about moving beyond the ego. And there's a wonderful extract, I think in chapter 18, essay 18, on this series of transpersonal psychological essays about ego development and transegoic identity, called The Varieties of Egolessness. And this is the problem of ego misconception with a spiritual lens. Bear with me, we're going to frame out the problems and then give some solutions, and then we'll learn how to develop a healthy ego. What is the issue with the language around ego, and what's the issue with our thinking around ego identity? I'll let the quote speak for itself. Here we run into an unfortunate mix of vocabulary. The system referred to by these formulations is the Western psychodynamic psychology of ego development, and this is after a few pages talking about the varieties of ego challenges and ego dysfunctions. And then there is a jump or a switch to an Eastern-based spiritual vocabulary that makes it seem as if the ego that has been formed is the same ego that is being abandoned. Yet listen to the Dalai Lama on this point, quote, selflessness is not a case of something that existed in the past becoming non-existent. Rather, this sort of self is something that never did exist. What is needed is to identify as non-existent something that always was non-existent. It is not ego in the Freudian sense that is the actual target of the Buddhist insight. It is, rather, the self-concept, the representational component of the ego, the actual internal experience of oneself that is targeted. Final key element here. What is being transcended here is not the entire ego. Rather, self-representation is revealed as lacking concrete existence, which is why self-representation, if actually we said to someone, that girl needs to drop her self-representational fixation, rather than ego. No one's going to say that. No one's going to say that at the office. She's full of self-representational fixation, because what's actually happening is that she's defending a false self. She's defending a narrative. She's projecting. She's creating all kinds of constructs here and there and all kinds. It's not her. It's not her ego. It's her self-representational fixation with a bit of delusional narrative kind of woven into there. Finish off the quote. In the words of the Dalai Lama, this seemingly solid, concrete, independent, self-instituting I, under its own power that appears, does actually not exist at all. And then talking about the aspects of the self being an enemy and here and there, and it goes quite deep into the psychological theory. But what we fundamentally need to realize comes from this beautiful diagram is that the ego and the self develop over time. I'm going to bring that back in just a moment. Read the quote of ego development, and then we're going to go into some actual solutions and wrap it all together. We've framed out the problem around ego side and dropping the ego and what's actually happening. Let's go into the stages of ego development and actually get clear on this. Quote from Edward Edinger on Ego and Archetype, a wonderful Jungian take on symbolic mythical individuation. It is generally accepted among analytical psychologists that the task of the first half of life involves ego development with progressive separation between ego and self. That's what you saw in the diagram. Development of the ego and then separation from the self, because self is undifferentiated. That's what we're born with. We're born with an immutable and eternal, beyond words aspect of self-identity. And some would say that includes our soul. There's a variety of technicalities to get into. Whereas the second half of life requires a surrender, or at least a revitalization of the ego as it experiences and relates to the self. The current working formula, therefore, the first half of life is ego self-separation, and the second half of life is ego self-reunion. Wonderfully captured by that little right there. And you can see the diagram for yourself. The ego is developing, and look, it's gone all the way outside the circle. And then the task is to bring it back together. And if you go for Michael Washburn's Transpersonal Psychological Theory, there are 3 general stages to human development. You have the pre-egoic, the egoic, and the trans-egoic stages. This is like one of the best transpersonal psychology books out there. Just read this masterwork. What's happening in the egoic stage? Pre-egoic is before you kind of become a toddler and have a sense of I. Trans-egoic is the state of integration, the state of self-actualization. But realistically, self-actualization can occur within an ego context. Let's just frame out. Before we get into the actual practical advice, I'm trying to do so much in this video. Please read the books for yourself. It's quite a whirlwind of ideas. I understand. Thank you for bearing with me. What's going on with the ego development stage? Let's slow it right down. The egoic stage, as defined by Michael Washburn, where most people spend their life. Some people never self-actualize. Some people never have a glimpse of trans-egoic reality. Most adults live the majority of their life in the egoic stage, and if you do it in a healthy way, that's creating a healthy, mature ego. The primary characteristics of the egoic stage are, number 1, a deeply underlying repressive infrastructure that supports the mental ego and insulates it from the deep unconscious and therefore from the dynamic ground. That's the self, the Jungian self, the dynamic ground, and again, you have to go into the terminology in particular. We're talking about the unconscious in a generalized way, the undifferentiated unconscious, the sea of all forms. The ego comes out and you say, I am this and I am not all that. A solid sense of self, that's the number 1 responsibility. Number 2, self-contained, privatized consciousness associated primarily with mental life and dissociated from physical and instinctual life. This is why the ego development comes with maturation and with cultural consciousness, an ability to take on values, take on morals, take on a sense of right and wrong. We're undifferentiated from completely archaic primal urges. We no longer have the ability to go and just cause massive harm. We think about consequences. We have a mental aspect. We have a moral aspect. Number 3, characteristic of the ego stage: apparent ego independence, self-control, and command of the will. Those are very important aspects. If you don't have a healthy ego, you will not have independence, self-control, and the command of your own will. If you have blurry egoic boundaries, if you don't know where you start and where they begin, if you're stuck in codependent dynamics, or you're maybe fragmented, dissociated, schizophrenic leaning, and you're in fantasy space and bedazzled by the incredible angelic visions or terrified of the hell realms, you haven't got actual agency to the degree that you could have, because you're a little bit too uncertain at the boundaries of identity, which is why you shouldn't be in a meditation circle if you're already unhinged, because if you are unhinged and you try and bypass your ego even further, what happens when the elastic band snaps all the way back and you've gone off with a mystical revelation, but you haven't got the character strength to be able to integrate it? You end up in a spiritual emergency. Just beware of that. The 4th characteristic of the ego, we're being really technical, really precise. Hopefully this is encouraging your appetite. If you're still here this far into a video like this, then clearly you're interested in very nerdy things. Number 4 aspect of the ego stage: the secondary process. Oh, this is a dense one. The secondary process or operational cognition, whether the concrete operations of the latency years or the formal operations of adolescence and later years, and as the egoic stage moves... So this here, let's unpack this a tiny bit. The secondary process or operational cognitions, this is where we're going deep into childhood developmental psychology. We can probably skip over this one. Fundamentally, what Michael Washburn's trying to communicate here is this idea that the ego is not just something which happens. You develop an ego, let's say age 2, age 3, earlier than that, depends on the theorist. Let's say by age 2, you've got a signified ego, that sense of you even refer to yourself as I, me, my name. You start speaking. That's a very good sign. The ego, of course, grows throughout adolescence, and informal or more latency stage operations of the ego, which is, I'm just getting so basic human developmental functions progressively mature as our ego matures. We become smarter, we become more emotionally attuned, we grow, we scale, we expand, we self-actualize, and the ego grows with us. It's not a case that the ego develops and it doesn't mature. In fact, the ego, in most cases, will mature throughout life unless there's a major congealing and condensing, and it's actually, unfortunately, what happens with many people once they've reached midlife, because they stop learning, they stop growing, they stop pushing themselves to learn new things. But naturally, during childhood and adolescence, we have a variety of very technical processes that all collapse down to we grow, and the ego allows us to grow. Having an ego is almost like the bucket that we store our memories and experiences in, and that means that we get to take them into the next day. If we didn't have an ego identity, they would just pass right through us and we'd be in the non-dualistic void. It would just pass away. Final quality of the ego, and this is when it comes to midlife, and this is where we signal towards the next stage of human development: a sense of emptiness and alienation together with a corresponding impotence towards transcendence. And then we go into transegoic identity. That was a hell of a lot to bring through. Thank you for sticking around. I'm sure I lost quite a few people there with that process. If you're still here, clearly you are. The Ego in the Dynamic Ground is a book that you really need to take at least a week or two to read for yourself. That final moment there, that number 5 point, usually around midlife, there's some kind of feeling of alienation or emptiness and a desire to go trans-egoic. That's the appropriate time for going beyond the ego, but it's not age-bound. A 20-year-old man or woman in a meditation circle can have the ability to transcend their ego as long as they know that they're going to come back in and not get fixated on transcendence, because their ego identity, this is a crucial point. Their ego identity isn't unpalatable. They don't set up a war against their self where, this is so language specifics, They don't set up a war against themselves where they value the self more than the egoic self, or the representational self concept becomes a stand-in for the egoic self, and then they see no other option but to escape into spiritual bypass or to regress into very destructive behaviors which still aim towards the same thing. Ultimately, they want to destroy the ego. If you look all the way into the ideation around taking your own life, if you really go deep into that psychology, very rarely does someone actually want to end their life. They want to end the self-representational context that they exist inside of, both the narrative, the identity, and the environment. They want to kill their ego, which doesn't mean take their own life. They actually want to end the conceptual self, not the deeper self. That's a topic for another question. I feel like I may even be going a little bit too far, and it's very difficult. It is very difficult to make a video like this because I can't give you a full overview of the complexities of ego psychology in just 15 or 20 minutes, and it would feel like a cop-out or some kind of waste of your time to just say, this is how you develop a healthy, strong ego. You have responsibilities in the world, you have a meaningful job, you have meaningful relationships, you probably start a family, or at least you have some significant role in the community, you develop a sense of right and wrong, you develop a moral compass, you have some kind of creative outlet, you do a variety of things out there in the world and inside your own world that give you a sense of, yes, I am this. This is me, but then you don't take it too far to become rigid because you have the ability to get transegoic when appropriate. You have a meditation practice, you read mystical texts, you go beyond your own self-identity, and fundamentally, you can also do that in a very practical sense by helping other people. It stops becoming about you, but don't skip the stage of knowing who you are. Don't think that you can go all the way into it's about other people, or all the way into it's actually about my soul. It's all about my soul and not this human flesh suit, this passing samsara. You're bypassing. It doesn't work. You will eventually return towards the point where your body ego, and this is where we go pre-egoic, your body ego, and this is so fun, your body ego will switch on, and you'll get some kind of disease, some kind of sickness, and good luck trying to pretend that you're an enlightened soul when you've got digestive issues and you're spending a lot of time on the toilet. You will be humbled. Good luck pretending that you're an enlightened, transcended being when you're still struggling with issues related to creaky bones or all kinds of issues, I don't know, with your, whatever it might be, whatever those embarrassing health complaints are. You'll be dropped back into your ego, and maybe the self-representational concept then becomes a spiritual ego, and we say, oh, well, they need to drop their spiritual ego, and we get into spiritual narcissism. I don't know if we're even in useful territory at this point in the video. I may not have done a great job with representing the self-representational concept, but you can see why it's so difficult. You need to do this work for yourself. You need to take the time to read. I truly recommend this book and this book, which I turned all the way. What a mess of a video. Let's keep it real though. Keep it real. Read the book, read that book, read this book. There's probably like 50 other books that you could read. I want you to know who you are. And this video is probably just about scraping over the 80% good enough margin of me still putting it on the internet, which for me, little aside, my perfectionistic standard is, if it is 80% good enough, and if there are at least a couple hundred people who will be watching to this point and they'll find some value, and if a couple dozen of them buy the books, I've done my job, because it's up to you. You're going to forget that this video existed. You're going to forget that I said all this. You're going to forget that I rambled around on this video because other videos are much sharper and to the point. But maybe you'll order one of these books and your ego will become a little bit healthier, a little bit stronger, and then you'll be able to make more change in the world and live a better life, and then know when it's appropriate to go off into the spiritual and come back into the earthy. That's all I have to say. There's the next video. What a mess. What a mess. Doesn't really matter though, does it? I haven't got any ego involved about it. Drop my ego. It's all fine.